and welcome to the final section of the series. I'm going to turn the mic over to the OSHER president, Sylvia Paxton, who's going to introduce our speaker. But before doing that, I wanted to thank you very much for the support you've given to this series. It's been most helpful. I also want to encourage you to submit your questions, and if you need additional cards, they will be available at the break. We're also welcoming any suggestions for improving this program, and if you have ideas about a session next year, please let us have those, and we'll certainly consider them. Now over to Sylvia Paxton.
Good morning. Excuse me a minute. First thing I want to do is acknowledge the wonderful underwriters and sponsors who have helped us put on this series of events. Kendall, the continuing care community where so many vital seniors live, have supported OSHER at Dartmouth, formerly Iliad, with corporate gifts for a long time. But we also receive many, many gifts from the residents there of their time, their volunteering, and as volunteers, students, and study leaders. And we're very grateful. Caldwell Law helps all of us with estate planning and settlement, getting our affairs in order. Ledyard Bank is a full-service bank, helps us with whatever we need in the banking department. Wells Fargo are the financial advisors who will help us invest for our retirement and our families. There are two special companies here. I won't forget King Arthur. Hypertherm isn't up today, but Hypertherm and King Arthur are both employee-owned companies in our area. A very forward-thinking approach. And today, King Arthur Flour has donated the cookies, which we will enjoy during the break. And we're very grateful for all that help. 25th anniversary schedule. I just want to flash this up for you. I have a letter in the beginning of this program, which I'm sure all of you have memorized. And because of it, I need to specify that if you have written September 3rd on your calendar as the convocation for our 25th anniversary, it has been canceled because President Hanlon has been called out of town. We're waiting for a later date. There'll be more about that. I just didn't want any of you to be disappointed without having prior knowledge. Before I introduce Bob, it takes a lot of people and a lot of time to put on a program like this, and I'm going to ask people to stand so that we can acknowledge them, and I'm going to ask you to hold your applause and thanks until we finish. So, the summer lecture series began years ago when David Bisnow started it, and he and his wife, Faye, entertained people in their homes and started the whole shebang. Bruce McDonald took over and ran it for years, and when Jan told him that if he wanted to continue to be married, it was time to let it go, Tom Blinkhorn very kindly stepped into the breach. So I'm going to start with you, Tom. Would you stand and remain standing for me for a moment? Ginnia Allison, founder of Iliad. Mike Galbraith is out of town. Is John Ferries here today? Corlin Johnson, Deborah Luquier. Deborah, I know you're here somewhere. Thank you. John Matthews, Joe Medlicott, Joe's in the back, Rosemary Scabata, Ian Sim, over there, Townsend Swayze, Steve Toffel, and also all those who have taken tickets at the door and helped out in other ways. Thank you very, very much. You've read Bob Rae's bio in the program, I'm sure. So I'm going to synthesize it by information he had on his blog describing himself, and then I'm going to tell you a short anecdote. His description on the blog is lawyer, mediator, speaker, writer, political leader, active on First Nations, social justice, international issues, and a liberal. And I learned by going on to Wikipedia and other sites, and I would invite you to do the same, he's a remarkable gentleman, that he spent some time in Washington, D.C. as a young man and had a paper route. And he was delivering the Evening Star newspaper, which he later described as one of the worst newspapers in the history of modern journalism. But his customers included Richard Nixon and Estes Kefauver. He later joked that Kefauver gave him a $20 gift one Christmas, whereas Pat Nixon only gave him a quarter. And that made him sympathetic to Democrats from that moment on. So, without further ado, Bob Rae.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the chance to be here today. I have this reality that I face as a Canadian, that when I come outside the country, nobody has a clue who I am. Whereas in Canada, I am, for better or for worse, fairly well recognized in airports and so on. I really do appreciate the introduction, but I have to make one small correction. It was actually 10 pennies that Pat Nixon gave me. Very carefully counted out, which has left an indelible impression on me as a young guy. I'm really delighted and very honored to be asked to speak in this series, and it's a remarkable series that you've had. It is a great, I think, opportunity for all of us to reflect a little bit on how the world is changing and what the position of the United States is in that rapidly changing world. The good news for you today is that I continue to refuse to use PowerPoints even when I teach at the university at a seminar, and one of my seminar students said, Mr. Rae, every other professor, gives us PowerPoints. And I say, yeah, but the problem with the PowerPoint is that you end up looking at the screen and not engaging in the conversation which is taking place. So there will be no movies, there'll be no PowerPoints. It's just a conversation. And I want to congratulate the organizers for giving us such a long time for questions and answers and comments. For those of you who are interested, I have written a little book. I've written a number of books, and one's coming out next week called What's Happened to Politics, which is really an account of how the political process has changed over the last 50 years, not for the better, I would add, and how difficult it is to penetrate the ads and the way in which the dialogue and conversation is now being imposed on the public, not only in Canada, which the book is mainly about, but also in the United States and, in fact, around the world. But before that, I did write a book called Exporting Democracy, which is really the subject of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is how power and influence are changing, not just for the United States, but for the world and for everyone. As pointed out, I did have the benefit of a childhood spent in the United States, and my father was a Canadian diplomat for his whole professional career, and we spent a lot of time, he spent a lot of time in the UN system. And I grew up in that world and grew up with so many American friends, both when I was at school in Washington and also later on in Geneva. It was a tough life as a kid. I mean, I had a really hard time. Once when I first went into politics, I was called a silver spoon socialist by one of my opponents. And I stopped the proceedings and said, look, I really resent that comment. And my chauffeur resents it, and my nanny resents it as well. And I used to say that I was born in a log embassy. So I hope that nothing that I say is interpreted as being in any way, shape, or form anti-American, because it isn't. But there are a number of features of American self-identification in the world which I don't think will work anymore, and I don't think are helpful to allow for the development of a better understanding and relationship between the values that Americans espouse and what's going on in the world today. But please do not interpret this as being in any way, shape, or form unfriendly to your country. Canada and the United States, I don't have to tell you, are the closest of friends and allies. We have families that are interconnected. We have a border which is supposedly the longest undefended border in the world, although I would notice that it's becoming a little more defended in the last 15 years than it has been before. It is really, I think, important for people to hear the views and expression of opinion and feeling outside the United States. There is at one and the same time in the world tremendous admiration for your country, and to a remarkable degree, the world has come to espouse and admire the values that are, in many respects, at the heart of the American experiment, if I can refer to it in that way. However, there's also concern and fear, and there's also, I think, a sense that there needs to be a different and better relationship, and that sometimes when we hear the American political conversation, it's hard to recognize the modern world in that conversation. So let me start by attacking a premise of American political discourse, which is that somehow America is an exceptional country. It's called exceptionalism, or American exceptionalism. And even President Obama, who at one point was a little iffy on whether there was such a thing, was forced to kind of repent publicly and embrace the idea that America was better and different and an exceptional country with an exceptional mission in the world, and could not be considered in the same way that other countries could be considered. So that every American politician has to say that America is the best, America is the most democratic, America is the most advanced, America is the most free, and is the best country in the world to live in, and there are no comparisons anywhere else. May I, as a Canadian, simply say, I don't think so. I hesitate to say that sometimes in Canada you hear politicians trying to get on the same bandwagon with respect to our own country. And as much as I like my own country and love it and I'm very proud of my citizenship, I would never pretend that somehow Canada is outside history, and neither is the United States. One of the things that I think we try to do, and my talk today is going to try to do, is situate where we are today in history, in time, and establish that the rules of history and geography and international law apply to the United States as much as they apply to any other country. And America is not the only place that sees itself as an exceptional place. As Canadians, we understand this because we have lived our whole lives, the life of our country, has been spent in the shadow of one empire or another. After all, when the French first came to North America, they were the imperial power, and they established rule over the Aboriginal people who lived in Canada at that time. Then the British and French fought each other on our land, as they did on yours. And the British won out. Treaty of Paris in 1763. The story goes that the French sort of gave Canada away, saying it's just a bunch of snow and we'll give it away to the British. They won't know what to do with it. So we became part of the British Empire. We didn't follow you in the Great Rebellion of 1775. We took the different course of a peaceful evolution towards self-government in 1867 and over time became more independent. And we finally got our Constitution home in 1982. We do things gradually in Canada. We're not in a hurry to get it done. There was no Tea Party or anything of that nature. But the arrogance of empires has always been the thought that the empire is different. I mean, when I went to school in the 1950s, on the walls of our classrooms, there was a world map. And most of the map was pink, reflecting the British Empire and Commonwealth as it was. And the thought at that time was that, the sun would never set on the British Empire, that its power and influence would remain forever, and that somehow what had happened to other empires would never happen to the British. But as we well know, it did, and it has. Although, when you listen to the British political discourse, you would think that there still is a very special place in the world for the particular British presence in the world, which frankly often has nothing to do with the state of the British economy or how people really feel about England. So, as a Canadian, I guess I have a kind of unique impression or sense that we are now going through a similar process, and the world is going through a similar process of reassessing the position and place of America in the world. That there were a particular set of circumstances that gave rise to an extraordinary degree of American power and influence in the world, and that these circumstances are starting to change and evolve. And as they change and evolve, America's position in the world will be changed and challenged. There's no cause for fear in this process, and it is not simply a way of describing decline. It's a way of describing change and evolution. And it requires leadership that understands that change and that also understands that there's still a huge place for American leadership an American authority in the world. Let me try, in the space of the time that we have available, to take you back in time to the struggles that took place in Europe in the middle of the 17th century. Let's remember that the 17th century should be up. Is it up? It's a miracle. The 17th century was a time of extraordinary violence and conflict in Europe. The battle was about religion and about faith and about the position of religion in the lives of people. So you had the 30 Years' War in Europe and in Germany. You had the Civil War in France. You had the Civil War in England. You had people burned at the stake. You had people who were killed in the most violent fashion because they could not worship in the way in which other people wanted them to worship. And they could not see God in the same way that other people wanted them to see God. It was a period of extraordinary violence, extraordinary confusion, and there were tens of millions of people who died in this conflict. Next to the 20th century, it was the most violent period in the Western world. And I stress the violence of this and also the fact that there was no political consensus, there was no agreement on how things should be. You had Protestants and Catholics in England, you had Protestants and other Protestants in England, you had Protestants and Catholics in France and in Germany. But what was the battle really about? It was about the sense that unless you accepted the power of either the Catholic faith or the Protestant faith, you could not live. Does this sound familiar to you when we look at the newspapers today? Sometimes, we teach, we lecture, we look at the world around us and we lecture the Africans and the people living in the Middle East, and we say, well, why can't you, what's this fuss all about? Why can't you people get along? Without realizing and remembering the violence of our own origins. How was the violence settled? Well, it was settled, and I think most people would say that the guy who kind of summarized the nature of the settlement originally was Thomas Hobbes. Because Hobbes wrote his famous book, The Leviathan. Hobbes spent the English Civil War in Holland. Good place to be. And he, in writing the Leviathan, what he basically said was, look, you have to give up your own sense of authority to the sovereign. You have to accede to the sovereign, and you have to accept that power. Because if we don't, life will be, in the famous expression, nasty, brutish, and short. And so there was kind of a practical consensus that emerged after all of that violence that said, okay, we accept the authority. And as a correlation of that, we will accept religion as a private space, not a public space, but a private space. As a space where we will practice our own faith, but we'll accept the fact that there are going to be people of different faiths living next to us. And you had, relative stability in the United Kingdom after the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Why is this important? Because slowly but surely, the battle became not in terms of religious faith, but it became establishing the legitimacy of the power that was being exercised. A lot of people said about Hobbes, well, it's pretty blunt instrument to say that you have to give up everything to the power of the sovereign, and the sovereign is all powerful and tells you what to do. And slowly but surely, we see underneath that an evolution of the idea of the rule of law, of legitimacy, of how it is that the ruler has to be accountable to the people and has to be subject to some important principles of law. And there have to be limits to power and ways in which power is carried out in a way that is seen as legitimate and acceptable. And as Americans, you're very familiar with this because that's what the American Revolution was all about. It was about making power legitimate. Now, if you were a black slave in the middle of the 18th century, you wouldn't have thought that the transformation from the British to American sovereignty was that special. And if you were a woman, you wouldn't have been affected by it at all, one way or the other. So let's not say that the Founding Fathers created democracy, because they didn't. But they did create the principle that power has to be held accountable, and that power has to be responsible, and that power must respond to the claim of moral legitimacy for it to be legitimate. A process of evolution and of revolution, but a process that has taken time. And slowly but surely, the democratic idea, through all of the change and revolutions which took place in Europe after the 18th century, have been about this process of legitimacy, of turning power into something we would call authority. So here you all are, sitting here in this hall, listening to this guy who you really don't know talk to you, and you're listening relatively quietly. Now, some of you may be off in some other world of your own. That's fine. I can't do anything about that. But you're being quiet. Why are you being quiet? Because you accept the legitimacy of this relationship that's been established. It's not a relationship of power. I haven't come in here with Mounties in red uniforms threatening you to say, if you don't shut up, Mr. Rae will not come on stage. None of that has had to happen. Because we've been culture, there's been a culture of acceptance of this relationship throughout going to school and going to university, and then we sit and listen to a speaker and we ascribe some degree of legitimacy to what he says. And the only form of rebellion that we have is either falling asleep or just turning it off, just saying, well, whatever he's saying, I'm not listening to a word he's saying. But very rarely do you get into a situation which would be described as one of revolution or breakdown of the authority relationship, in which you're jumping up and down and saying, it wouldn't have, it does, in the 60s, we can remember situations where that happened. There have been other situations where it happened, but my point is, there is such a thing as authority which is different from power. I have no power over you. None. I can't create huge fear. All I can do is try to persuade you of the legitimacy of what I'm saying. And that's what the democratic process is about. The democratic process is about recognizing legitimacy. The crisis in authority and legitimacy that we've seen at various moments in history is being repeated today in large parts of the world. And in the post-war world, post-1945, there was a slow process of America accepting that it had a role and responsibility in the wider world. And it's been a long, steady process of engagement and discussion and of power and of influence. But the world which Woodrow Wilson tried to lead America into after the First World War, and the world which Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman led the United States into in the post-45 world, was very different from what it is today. If we simplify the history for a moment and say, well, let's start with the world after 1945, what did you have? You had a Europe which was devastated, destroyed, the Japanese Empire which was defeated, humiliated. You had a Soviet Union which was devastated by the war, but nevertheless resilient and determined to continue to exercise its influence. And you had an American economy that had grown to a great success, great innovative capacity, great influence in terms of its ability to create new technological innovation and to drive the forces of change, which had a relatively open field in the world after 1945. And so the world that we've seen since that time has been a world where a rising prosperity internationally has benefited the United States. And President Kennedy described this in one of his famous phrases where he said that a rising tide lifts all boats. And it was that world in which, looking out at the audience and when I look at a mirror this morning, we're all part of this process of transformation. We've all benefited from it. And we've all been part of it. And it's important, I think, for us to celebrate how wonderful that process and that transformation has been, but also to recognize that some of the conditions which gave rise to it are not the same today as they were before. It's important, I think, to reflect on the fact that two things have happened. First of all, capitalism has triumphed in a way that would never have been expected by many, many people in the world, even 25 years ago. Up until 1989, the great debate in the world, and from the middle of the 19th century right up to 1989, the central question was between capitalism and socialism on the economic side. What's the best way to organize an economy? And I think it's important for us to recognize that with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, something else happened. It wasn't just a physical collapse of a wall. It wasn't just the change in the structure of the Soviet Union. It was much bigger than that. It was a recognition that the debate of our time is not capitalism versus socialism. I think even Bernie Sanders would agree with this perspective. The debate of our time is, what kind of capitalism do we want to have? And the question of our time is, how can we make the capitalism that we have more capable of generating prosperity for everyone, for more people? Because since that time, the moral connection between the economy and our democracy has been challenged. And it's been challenged for the simple reason that the gap between those who are doing really well and those who are doing less well has grown. And that while the general prosperity of the American, Canadian, European economies has improved the standard of living of everyone, still true, we have to recognize that there is a problem with the way the modern economy is working and operating. But it is not a debate anymore about, well, then let's scrap capitalism and let's bring in some completely new system in which the government and the people control and own all the means of production. No, that's not on the agenda. And you can never say never, but I don't believe it will be on the agenda. The more difficult question is, how do we ensure that the prosperity that we have is more widely and deeply shared? And connected to that is the question of how do we ensure that that prosperity is truly sustainable and that the way in which we are producing goods and services in the world doesn't end up endangering the health of the planet itself. So those are transformative issues which we need to understand. And you can't disconnect those questions, those economic questions, from what's happening to American power and influence, and how do we see that going forward in the world today. You can't separate those things out. Nor can you pretend that the American economy and how it is currently functioning and how it is seen to function in the world is not a major factor in how American power and influence is perceived. So let me just say to you very bluntly, if America's budget was balanced, if America had a coherent policy on environmental sustainability, and if America's economy was one which was generating wealth for a broader spectrum of Americans rather than being seen as a source of tension between different groups of Americans, American power and influence in the world would be much greater. But everybody here has to understand that this aversion to the idea of ever raising taxes or even discussing how that might be done, the pretense that you can carry on borrowing indefinitely and that there will be no long-term consequences of that for America's power and influence in the world is nonsensical. And yet, I must confess, when I watch the American debates, and I don't quite know what to say about your current situation, and I know there are many Republicans in the audience, and or there must be some Republicans in the audience, and I wish you well in your choice. But although I have to say that I come from a city which elected Rob Ford as their mayor, so I'm not here to lecture you on the possibilities of what might emerge in the Republican primaries, except to say this. I find, and I was at a dinner the other night, and somebody was saying, oh, Trump will never win, this is all a joke, and, how could anybody take him seriously? And I said, you're the same people who are telling me that Rob Ford would never be elected mayor of Toronto. So don't think it isn't possible. Anything is possible, I'm afraid, unless people get organized about it. But it is really important to come back to this central idea that power and influence are related to success and to legitimacy. And that if you keep a hold of this idea all the way through, it's not about can you send troops somewhere, but it is going to be increasingly about are we running our countries in such a way that they will be seen as a credible and creditable model by other countries? Or are we in fact doing such a mediocre job at that we can't legitimately claim to have huge power and influence? So let me give you just one other simple example, and that is in the growing field, which is one I have been involved with over many years, which is the governance field, and talking to countries about their constitutions and democracy and how democracy should work. The American model is one that is not frequently looked at, and people say this is a wonderful way to run a democracy. This is the best way to do it. It's to have huge power blocks, and it's to have vast amounts of wealth concentrated in relatively small places, and it's to have people able to spend as much money as they want during an election. We spend all of our time in giving advisory work to countries around the world to say, please try to diminish the power of money and the influence of money over your democratic process. Get as much control as you can in the hands of ordinary people and limit the power of wealth to influence what happens. The American system is the opposite. It is one in which there is greater power concentrated in fewer hands, and one in which that power is wielded because the Supreme Court has said, in its wisdom, that free money is free speech. Well, that's a terrible idea when you think about it. I mean, and you think about what money can buy and how much advertising people can watch, and people say, well, this is a wonderful, wonderful process we have, and it's the best democracy in the world. Well, no, it isn't. It's a thriving country and a thriving democracy and an exciting political culture, and certainly for the rest of the world, a source of vast entertainment in terms of watching it. But the idea that this is somehow more democratic than many, many other countries which are advanced democracies and complex societies is just not true. The two major things that are at stake here. One is when you talk about power and influence going into the future from an international perspective. The first one is the economy. How the economy functions, how well it functions, how innovative and creative it truly is, and how public finances run and operate. And again, when you look through the lens of history, why do empires get into big trouble? Why do they collapse? A lot of it's about money. A lot of it's about budgets and debt. A lot of it's about how the process of accumulating great debt creates great problems, and then ultimately drives governments to have to raise taxes, which then creates huge problems with public opinion in terms of how that's being done, and the empire ultimately collapses under its own weight. You can't understand the decline of British power and influence unless you understand the cost of the First World War, the cost of the Second World War, and how improbable it would be that this huge, vast structure would be able to continue indefinitely. America does not live outside history. America lives inside history. And the same forces at work that have influenced other countries and other situations influence the United States. And so the power and influence of the United States will change. And it will change because the force of globalization, this is one of the ironies of the success of capitalism, is that it spreads. And as it spreads, new countries take on new capacity to innovate. So if you were to say, take a photograph of what the world was like in 1945, what were the top American companies in 1945, and then say, well, what does the world look like today, and what are the top companies in the world today? It's a completely different picture. It's a completely different picture. And it's one in which, yes, there's huge regenerative capacity in the American economy. There's great capacity for innovation. And yes, American industries, companies are leading the way in terms of innovation. But it's a big world out there. And it's a different world than the one which people said, well, we're going to simply look up to one country as we go forward. The second issue has to do with how power can be exercised in the world in which we're living today. And here we go back to the principles that I talked about earlier about power and authority and legitimacy, and recognize how much has changed and indeed how much is challenged today in a way that requires a very different approach from the United States and from other powers. Vietnam should have been an object lesson in the simple fact that no matter how much military capacity you have, that power does not guarantee political success and political influence. Unfortunately, it was a lesson that was not fully absorbed and not fully appreciated. And and I'm like all of you, I'm part of this generation. One of the ironies that we face is that even a year after the Vietnam War was over, nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And if you don't want to talk about it, you're not going to be able to learn the lessons from it. Lessons about how it is that a great military power like the United States could essentially be defeated. And it was a defeat. There's no point in describing it any other way. Now, a lot of the consequences of that defeat were not as significant as people told us they would be in the 1960s. You remember the domino theory? We were told that if Vietnam went communist, then it would be a matter of time before all the other countries in the region would become communist, and there would be this domino effect. And so in order to stop the spread of the cancer of communism, the only way to do that was to go to war. And that war did not succeed, but the consequences of not winning the war were not as, quote, bad as we were told they would be. A lot of the things that were supposed to have happened didn't happen. But the main lesson from that was not necessarily ever publicly understood or embraced in the political debate. In fact, it was rarely discussed. You just change the subject. As we say, move on. Next topic. And when that happens, you don't necessarily learn the lessons. Similarly, when we look back at what's happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and Canadians are very much implicated in this. We lost 163 soldiers in Afghanistan. Not a large number compared to the United States, but if you multiply by 10, it's a fair number of casualties, more than we've ever seen in modern times. And had a real impact in terms of Canada's own sense of, well, what are we doing there, and what do we think we can actually accomplish, and how do we think we can actually get there? And what we've had to come to terms with is that as valid and as significant as the value of democracy is, it cannot be exported like a refrigerator or a car. It isn't something you simply superimpose on a country. And there is this thing that happens that as soon as you go to war for whatever cause or reason, inevitably, democracy, human rights, the cause of freedom become the reason for it. And you're not going to leave until you succeed. So in our House of Parliament, we had a debate where very conservative members would stand up and talk about women's rights in Afghanistan. These are not people who necessarily were at the forefront of talking about women's rights in Canada, but nevertheless, they said, how can you stand there and raise questions about what's going on when that's why we're there? As if equality between women and men, which has been an idea that has emerged in Western Europe and in North America as a value over a period of hundreds of years, and has taken a huge social struggle in order to achieve, as if you can turn up on the streets of Baghdad and say, we have this idea here that women and men are supposed to be equal. So get with the program. It's a good idea. That isn't going to work. And it doesn't matter how many guns you have or how many people get killed. It isn't suddenly going to adhere to that culture and to that body politic. And the world is a complicated place. It's not like Hanover or Toronto. It's not like that. That's not what it's like. And there has to be some deeper appreciation of the limits of power, of the fact which, when you think about it, is actually a very, if you go back to the founding fathers, is actually a very powerful American idea, which is that power should be limited, and power needs to recognize its limits. Because unless that happens, it becomes abused. And also, it ultimately isn't effective. Which is why people like Joe Nye and others are talking about, soft power and other ways in which American power can be expressed and its influence can take place. But more and more, it's going to require an understanding that other people have to carry part of the load and part of the weight, and other countries have to be involved and engaged, and unless you engage in a process of recognizing that we're all in this together and that it requires us to be part of a common effort, it isn't going to happen successfully. Now, as a Canadian, I have a particular advantage because we are a country of 35 million people with a vast landmass. We're a relatively small country. So if we don't get along with people, that's our problem. We have to learn how to do that. We are by our very nature an international country, not only by virtue of who lives in Canada now, but also by virtue of the fact that 50% of our gross domestic product depends on trade. We have been intimately involved as a country with the development of every international institution, with every international treaty, with every international way of broadening understanding, increasing trading relationships, and on it goes. And we've also, as a country, been deeply involved in the creation of the World Court, the signing of Kyoto, a whole bunch of things that we did that had to do with accepting the premise that we couldn't do it on our own. We had to do it with others. America has had an ambivalent attitude towards this whole thought process of internationalization going back a long time. Because the premise of American thinking was America is different. And certainly out of the First World War, took a long time to get America into the First World War, but when they got there, they said, well, we're certainly not going to let the Europeans do this to the world again. And Woodrow Wilson played this extraordinary role at Versailles in trying to create a treaty and also trying to create international institutions, and then was unable to sell it to the Senate, unable to convince American political institutions that this is what needed to happen. And so there's always been this thought that somehow America could do it differently and should not be subjected to the same sort of way of doing things as some other countries, except so naturally. So America is not part of the International Criminal Court. America did not sign the Kyoto Agreement, and I'm not saying the Kyoto Agreement was great, but the fact that America has been outside these things has actually reduced America's influence rather than increased it, in my view. But I also know that there is no appetite. I mean, I wouldn't get elected dog catcher in the United States. There's no appetite to embrace these things in the American political institutions. We'll do it our way. So it's been arm's length with a lot of other agencies and so on. But this has come at a huge cost. The cost of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been in the trillions. And I'm not suggesting that in either case America was entirely on its own, because that would be untrue. There have been other countries and others involved and engaged who've taken on an equally strong position, Tony Blair and so on. So it's not as if America has just simply waltzed in and said, we're going to do this by ourselves. No, that's not true. But it is true that just as the lessons to be learned from Vietnam have not been publicly discussed, where is the accountability and the lessons to be learned from what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, you can have hearings on Benghazi, but you can't have hearings on, well, what the heck happened that we spent trillions of dollars and what do we have to show for it? What have we got? How do we deal with these conflicts? So the logic, I would argue, of America seeing itself as in the world and as having to take its place in the world with a whole bunch of others, and then engaging in a long, complex process of attempting to move and influence countries towards authority, legitimacy, accepting private space, accepting democracy, has got to be one that takes extraordinary time and extraordinary effort. And I really think that this is a critical issue for the United States, and I think it's a critical issue for the rest of the world. We depend on American innovation and American leadership and the vitality of the United States for our ability to move forward with this positive agenda. An agenda of increased accountability and attacking corruption, dealing with environmental degradation, expanding the role of the rule of law internationally, creating a better, stronger climate for human rights and so on internationally. This entire agenda has been one which America at its best has been deeply involved, engaged in, and its influence has been truly transformative. But every once in a while, I have the sense that in American society, there's a strong response to the notion of shut down borders, close walls. It's too complicated out there. Let's just hold back. And I guess my final thing that I'd like to say in closing up, so those of you who are sleeping now can wake up, is to say, however poorly the rest of the world may express it. We need you. We need this position. We need an America that's open, that's willing to listen, that's engaged. We need an America that actually is stronger and not weaker. And we need an America that wants to listen and learn and be part of the world's struggles. Not because America is better or the best or unique, but because it's a wonderful country. It has much to help the world, but it best does that by being thoroughly and completely part of the world. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have some wonderful questions. First thing I want to do is I inadvertently left Pete Weiler off the list of those who worked on the committee because he wasn't on the list. Secondly, I just want to announce that he and John Ferries will be the summer lecture series chairs for the next year. We look forward to that. It was great.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. You are very convincing. Are there voices in America, in the Americas, where someone might have a similar wisdom, and if so, who are they?
Well, I didn't see them at the last televised debate. I don't know whether this is being recorded or if there are any journalists here. I hope not. But I would have to express, again, I've written about this in the book that's coming out next week. The book is called What's Happened to Politics, if you want to go online and get it. The Canadian dollar is very cheap these days. Amazon.ca will have a sale on, so you'll get it for virtually nothing. So it's about Canada, but it's not just about Canada. It's about really what's happened to politics in general. And I do think that we face a real challenge of political leadership today in not only in Canada, but in the United States, but around the world. It's very difficult to tell people what they don't necessarily want to hear. And there's a famous comment by a guy who's now the head of the European Commission, who, when he was a politician in Luxembourg, of all places, said that we all know what to do, but none of us know how to get elected after we've done it. Which I think is actually a very intelligent remark. And I would have to say that I mean, all joking aside about Republicans and Democrats, I don't think that it's necessarily all the wisdom is confined to one political party. But I do think that everyone has to be very concerned about the extent to which we are dealing with a decline in debate and a decline in discourse, which makes democracy more difficult and not less difficult. And I think this applies to Democrats as much as it applies to Republicans. I think it applies across the political spectrum in Canada. And one of the reasons that the Trump phenomenon is a phenomenon, insofar as it is because the one thing you can say about him is that he's not packaged. Based on some of the stuff that comes out of his mouth, there's no way anybody could have said, here's a good thing to say. So, yeah, I do think, on the other hand, I'm a great believer in the maxim that good public policy and good leadership is what happens when all the other alternatives have been completely exhausted. And we may be getting to that point now on a couple of major issues in front of us.
Can you describe in some detail several countries' systems of governance that you consider good models for a democratic system? How do they keep money out of the election process?
Well, I mean, it gets a bit of a cliche. The Scandinavians, and again, these societies are not perfect. I mean, one benefit that we have in North America is that we have all the vigor of being relatively open, and and the degree of our openness has to do with the premise that we are immigrant societies. And I think one of the reasons that for all of our challenges in Canada and the United States, in Canada with respect to Indigenous people, in the United States with respect to the continuing tragedy of racial conflict in the United States, we remain societies that are open to change and open to a dynamism that comes from the fact that we accept newcomers and we accept the premise that you can be an American very quickly and you can become part of this society very quickly. And that is a great strength to have compared to a lot of other countries around the world. Japan, France, the Europeans, all have difficulty with the idea that they are in fact multicultural, multiracial societies which are open to immigration. And the great debate that's happening in Europe today, or frankly not happening, has to do with migration and how to deal with migration. So when I say, the Scandinavians have very tough rules on money, they have lots of ways in which they encourage people to participate, they create the capacity on the part of their fellow citizens to engage in the political process, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. That is, I think, true. So you say, well, those societies seem to work. It doesn't mean they're not subject to all the tensions and difficulties that we've seen. The Sweden that, again, all of us grew up with, the sort of social democratic, nirvana, is no more. I mean, it doesn't exist. They've had to go through a huge, difficult transformation as a society, and they have a very strong conservative and indeed even anti-immigrant movement in Sweden. So it has its own tensions. I think that some kind of proportional representation is a good idea. I think that the first past the post system, which we have in Canada, you have in the United States, the Brits have, is really the exception in the world. Most other democracies have some kind of way in which your vote is able to be expressed in somebody getting elected who comes close to representing what you actually think. Now, when you go to Israel, you realize that PR taken to an extreme means that very tiny parties can have a huge influence over the entire political process. So you say, well, there has to be some way of limiting that and controlling the extent to which that happens. But most democracies outside the UK and the US have stronger controls on fundraising than those two countries. The UK has virtually no control over fundraising, which is a real problem. And the US has what you all know, which is that money buys you a lot of candidates, a lot of influence, and running for office is enormously expensive. Just to give you a comparison, as a Canadian member of Parliament, which I used to be, and I retired in 2013, voluntarily, I would stress, I was not retired, I retired. And I was elected 11 times, both federally and provincially. In my own constituency, we call them ridings because historically it was a territory that you could ride around in a single day. But I represented the riding of Toronto Centre, which was no horses there from what I could tell. It's downtown Toronto. But my budget to run for office as a member of Parliament was less than $100,000. And that's limited by law, and limited by law is how much money anyone can contribute, and the limit is now $1,200 per person. And during an election, it's increased. You can pay $1,200 a year throughout the inter-election period, and then during election you can add that by adding another $1,200 for the election. So nobody can buy a result. By contrast, when I used to spend time visiting American congressmen and senators, and I mean, I don't say this to gain your pity, but it's very difficult for a Canadian visitor to get to see an American congressman or an American senator. They're very busy people. So I had a couple of friends and went to see one who made time to see me. And he had a list. You know, we all have these little things of what's your daily diary, and being a pre-tech guy, even older than I was, he had a card that his staff used to make out for him, which would be his day. And he showed me his card. He said, "This is why I'm so busy. 8 a.m. fundraising breakfast, 8:30 call Joe blogs, 9 o'clock call Frank, whatever, and mainly men. And this is all about money." And it was like nonstop. I said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "Well, how much time do you spend on money?" I said, "I don't spend any time on money. I don't have to. I have people, we organize, have a couple of fundraisers a year, have a big dinner once a year, and that's it. I'm done." We said, "Well, how can you do that?" I said, "Well, we limit how much people can raise and how much people can spend. And that's the way it works." And now, the current government in Canada has tried to change that a bit. They have, for example, we're now in the middle of an 85-day election campaign. And the reason that they've imposed this very long period for an election, as opposed to you guys who have 365 days a year for the rest of your lives, is because they have more money than the other parties do, and they are trying to use that greater financial power to make it more difficult for the parties to buy ads and compete with them in terms of all that sort of stuff. But still, more or less, money has less influence. The more you can do to keep money out of the political process as a defining power, the healthier your democracy is. And in fact, this is not. But this is not a view that is supported by obviously by the Supreme Court of the United States, but it's also not a view that's supported by the American political system. I mean, when John McCain tried to do something about it, he was not able to do it. He just couldn't be done. And now, of course, I think it would be almost impossible.
What accounts for the unwillingness of the United States to look at itself and learn from history? How important is it that the U.S. be powerful, and what if it is not number one? It's one question. We could separate it if you choose.
Well, I mean, I hate to disabuse you of anything, but there are a lot of areas in life where the United States is not number one. I mean, it just isn't. I mean, if you look at the data on even prosperity, productivity, how widely shared is that prosperity? Lots of ways in which America is not leading the pack. That doesn't mean, in my view, that America is in permanent decline. It just means that a little sort of humility would be appropriate in the circumstances. There are many ways and many explanations for this American exceptionalism. One of them actually is, ironically, that America is a relatively self-contained economy compared to a lot of others in the world. America isn't totally self-contained. It's obviously a huge trading country. But there are significant ways in which, like Germany, is very similar. And as a Canadian, we understand this because we are a trading country. More than half our GDP depends on trade. And we can't survive without, recognizing that we're part of of a much bigger piece and bigger puzzle. I think, frankly, I think it will take a more challenging economic environment for America to come to terms with some of the things that other countries have to come to terms with, like this question of budget deficits, like this question of the debt, like this question of even in terms of the rhetoric around corporate taxation. I mean, let me say, as somebody who's on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, more or less, America's policy on taxation of corporations makes absolutely no sense. It's driving your corporations to move outside your country. And it's driving, there's a very good, by the way, if you're interested, there's a very good editorial in this week's Economist magazine simply pointing out the fact that, every other country has had to learn this lesson, and if America doesn't learn the lesson, it will pay a price, and it is paying a price. And it means lowering corporate taxation and simplifying it and also limiting its territoriality. The IRS has a very long reach, and that long reach is ultimately counterproductive for American productivity and for creating greater corporate strength in the United States. This is not a view that you'll ever hear from a Democrat or many Republicans, but you need to. It doesn't make sense. And again, the process has to be one constantly of comparing ourselves to others. How do others do this? How have others done it better than us? What can we learn from them? Which is not a natural part of the American political conversation. I don't mean that ironically, but it just isn't. And it's too bad, because there's a lot of ways in which you can say, well, how do they do it differently how have they learned to do it better than us? And I think in Canada, we went through this very difficult time in the early 90s where the dollar was way down, our public debts were up. We went through a difficult recession in the early 90s, a very painful time. And Canadian governments of all stripes, including the one of which I was then the leader and led a government, had to make a whole bunch of very painful, difficult decisions because the world didn't owe us a living, and we simply had to make the change. If we didn't make the change, we'd be punished. And I think that's not something that people change when they have to, and the same thing's true for the United States. Things will change when people feel, well, we have no choice but to make a change.
I speak for myself, but I suspect almost everyone sitting here, when we were in school, were taught that we were to study history so that we would be prepared to be good citizens and not let the bad part of history repeat itself. You spoke of Vietnam. We've got Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you have any idea what accounts for the unwillingness of the United States to look back at itself and learn from history?
First of all, I don't think this is just an American problem. And I don't want this to be interpreted as somehow beating up on the United States. I think it's a problem that's actually fairly deeply ingrained in human nature. But having said that, the American culture is based on optimism and pragmatism, and things work. And I think there's a real reluctance to accept defeat, failure, and the lessons that we learn from failure. I was in Israel recently visiting a high-tech company, and there's a wonderful Israeli host to our small delegation who were looking at Israeli success and innovation. And he said, we want our companies to fail. We also looked at each other, what? He said, well, how do you learn anything if you don't fail? You've got to fail and then pick yourself up and figure out, well, how did that work? And in fact, in reality, America's success is based on failure. It's not based on success. It's based on people learning business lessons from how things didn't work out and how to do things better and how to do things. And that's what the spirit of experimentation is all about. This Israeli said to me, he said, look, And as a politician who has certainly been called a failure from time to time, I really appreciated this comment. In fact, I've repeated it many times to the point where my children are sick of hearing me say it. And that is that failure is an event, it's not a person. And I would say failure is an event, it's not a country. But nobody can look back at what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and previously Vietnam and say that the right lessons have been learned. Even President Obama, I would say, is not drawing the right lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan. The answer is not to disengage. The answer is the form of engagement. Disengagement is never the right answer because we don't have the luxury of disengagement. We don't have the luxury of not being sufficiently engaged to learn how to help and how to make a contribution. I'm not opposed to military assistance in the Middle East. I don't think ISIS can be left to sort of carry on its own as if nothing could be done. But I think that the way in which we approach it has to be based on the greater engagement of the countries that are the most directly impacted by what these guys are doing to their own countries. And that's a long, painful process. And it's not one that necessarily leads to quick results. But it's also, frankly, cheaper and more effective than what's been tried before.
Syria is going through its own 17th century violent revolution. What should the U.S. and other nations do? Stand aside and watch the slaughter?
No, we can't do that. We can't do it for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons is because the world, thank goodness, reality, the world we live in is very different from the way we lived in the 17th century. We have created international institutions, international law, international norms, a sense that we're trying to expand and extend the rule of law, and a sense of civility in the world. These are the ideals which are there in the United Nations Declaration. They're there in the Charter. They're there in the way in which we engage with each other in the world. So no, there's no way we can simply disengage and watch. My view, in fact, on Syria is that we watched for too long and failed to address the severity and the extent of the problem. And by the time people got engaged, it was a much more complex and difficult problem than the one that we thought we had. But I don't think there's a quick solution. And I think this may sound unduly harsh, but one of the things we have to understand is that there's some things we can't necessarily change quickly. And the other one is that if you really want to engage military power, you either have to use a whole lot or not much, because otherwise you're just carrying on a process of sort of trying to limit it a little bit, but really not have the impact that you want to have. But isolationism, I would beg and plead with you, is not the answer for the United States or for any other country. It's not a practical solution for your country, or certainly not for mine.
How can the U.S. exercise power and influence in a world with non-state actors such as ISIS?
Well, ISIS is a government by every other name. It is a government. And I think the thing we have to understand is that, like Al-Qaeda and other similar organizations and regimes and movements, they metastasize. And you have to get over the geographic fixation that the problem lies in one place. It's not a one-place problem. It's a problem that has its equivalents in so many other countries and so many other places. And the key thing to an intelligent policy is to understand that, this is not to go back over what happened, but the big mistake that the Bush administration made was to take its eye off the ball in Afghanistan after 9/11. Well, the mistake before that was to think that a simple military solution in Afghanistan would actually solve the problem, that you could defeat this idea and this movement, and then it would be over, and then a new government would be formed, and that would be the end of it. Not at all. That's not the nature of the problem. It has to do with the nature of Pakistan, with the connection between the Pakistanis and radical forces in Afghanistan. It has to do with a whole lot of issues that take time and strength to deal with. The issue for what happened was this fixation on Iraq was misplaced. And this fixation on Saddam Hussein was also misplaced. I'm not saying he was a good guy, but you have to accept the fact that there are a lot of bad governments and bad dictators in the world, and you know, if your mission in life is to get rid of all of them quickly, you're just embarking on an impossible course. It's not going to work. And having taken its eye off the ball in Afghanistan, and then the disaster in Iraq, where Vice President Cheney said, well, when we invade Iraq, the people are going to be strewing flowers in front of our feet, and it's going to be like the Americans going into Paris in 1944. Well, that just wasn't true. It didn't happen, right? We know that. I am a hardliner on a group like ISIS. I think you have to have a military component in dealing with ISIS. And there may even be a need for troops on the ground in ISIS. Somebody's troops, however those troops are organized. But it's a bigger battle than that, and that's why I started my talk by reminding this group and reminding people, as I do in my book, this is part of a broader transformation that happens in societies. And this central question of, can a religion accept the existence of other religions, is a deeply difficult challenge. And the transformation that took us from religion being a public issue to religion being a private issue is a huge cultural change. Huge. I mean, imagine the medieval world. Religion was everywhere. Religion was the public place. It was accepted by everyone. I mean, monotheistic and hierarchical and just widely accepted is common to feudal societies, and that's the challenge that we're seeing. These feudal societies are undergoing this huge transformation, and radical groups are trying to say, let's hold on to that, and let's go back to maintaining it. It's not tenable. In the long run, it will not work, it'll never work. But in the meantime, it's doing untold damage and causing untold suffering to the people who are being attacked by this kind of a policy. So I don't know how I don't think saying we're going to disengage from it is not a practical solution, but it requires a lot of time, attention, and diplomacy in order to, and as well as public persuasion and assistance with cultural change, helping those people who actually don't agree with that vision of what Islam is or what their religion should be.
Should the U.S. follow its principles?
Is that a bad sign?
No, it's not a bad sign. It's a time concern sign. Should the U.S. follow its principle or interests when attempting to help and influence the world? And how should these concepts be balanced? For example, we did not support the democratic Arab Spring movement in Egypt, but we supported the Egyptian military because of our interests.
How long have you got? I mean, this is a really deep question, but let me try to simplify it. And again, I talk about this in this book, Exporting Democracy. It's like, I think the attempt to differentiate between principles and interests is actually wrong. You have both. And it would be unnatural not to be trying to defend both. But it's not just American interest, it's also the interest of the Egyptian people. And it's one of the things that we take from the experience, this what I call this sort of key moment in our modern history in the 17th century, is that there was a conclusion that security was actually very important. And that in order to be able to create wealth and establish productive societies, you need to have security. You need to have an end to violence, an end to random terrorism, an end to uncertainty about the kind of world you're living in. I have many Egyptian friends. Most of them support the current government. Why? Because they provide security. And the army in Egypt plays a different role than in many, many other societies. It's a unique institution in that society in terms of the role that it plays as a force for social mobility, as an economic actor in the country. There's all kinds of ways in which it doesn't necessarily do what we think armies should do or how armies should be, but that's the way they are. I'm not a supporter of repression in Egypt for a moment. I think it's horrendous, some of the abuses that have taken place. But I do believe that one of the reasons why the Muslim Brotherhood fell apart was because they were the authors of their own misfortune. They did not recognize that providing a degree of security and balance to their society was a fundamental prerequisite for their holding on to power. And they weren't able to do that. And so they lost the confidence of the people. And while we can say, well, a 98% result in an election, what the heck does that mean? You do have to say, well, yeah, but it does mean that a lot of those people say, let's just have this issue resolved in favor of security once and for all. I actually think that, the Arab Spring should not be seen as a 28-minute television program. It's a long process of evolution within Arab society. It's very, very painful. It's highly contentious. It is not one that is going to happen easily and quickly, and you're not going to create liberal, democratic countries and governments in the Middle East in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. It's a long process. Think how long it took our processes to unfold. It's taken a long time. How do you deal with it? You deal with it by recognizing that it's tough and difficult, but that nevertheless these are things that should be supported over time, but also recognizing that there is a powerful desire on the part of any people for security, for stability. And where you don't have stability and security, you have chaos. And where you have chaos, people move and leave. I mean, think for a moment of what the refugee crisis now is in the world. The world refugee crisis is simply huge. If you think for a moment of a map, here's where having a map would be a good idea. But if you take a map and you go west from Afghanistan, through Iran, through all the Middle East, down through the Horn of Africa, across over Central Africa, right over to Nigeria. In Central Africa, you had what's called the African Civil War, which lasted for 25 years, and which 10 million people were killed. How many people know about that? How many people did anything about it? Nobody. But out of that has come a migration issue, which is simply huge. And Europe is dealing with it now. I mean, the tragedy of the boats in the Mediterranean these are just symbols of the extent to which this instability has created chaos. And these people have nowhere to go. Who's going to take them in? I don't see any American politicians saying, what we really need is to bring in 250,000 Syrians tomorrow. Nobody's saying that. Everybody's putting up walls and barriers. No Canadian politician is saying, let's do for the for the Syrians and the Iraqis, let's do for them what we did for the Vietnamese boat people. Nobody's doing that. So this is a huge humanitarian issue that we have to face up to.
How do you perceive America's success in technology and innovation? Is it a hindrance to our moral development and ability to listen and learn? And as an addendum, which relates back to a prior speaker, does Canada have a Silicon Valley?
We have many small Silicon Valleys. We have, well, my BlackBerry is being charged in the back room there, as long as I don't forget it. We're proud of our technological success near Ottawa, in the area around Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph Valley, in Western Canada and British Columbia, where there's a great deal of success and new and innovative companies coming along. What we don't have is a big enough capital market, and we have a real problem with venture capital. So what happens to a lot of our successes is that you guys buy them up, and then they migrate to your country. But thanks to your tax laws, we're now succeeding in bringing some of them back and basing the companies in Canada, not the United States. So it's actually, no, I mean, the first question is, do I think it's the American technological innovation? No, I think it's a defining feature of American society, is this capacity for technological innovation, and it is the one thing that the naysayers about the United States, those people say the United States is in terminal decline, and you remember over the years there have been lots of tendencies to say, when Japan started making better cars for a while, or different cars and whatever, and all the Japanese innovation happened, there were all kinds of books about how Japan was going to outdo the United States for all time. Then it was China was going to outdo the United States. I've always said to people, never bet against the United States. Never bet against the capacity for American innovation to make an enormous difference. But, in response to your question, does success make you less likely to listen? Yes. That's an almost universal phenomenon. Success makes you less likely to listen. Failure usually makes you a little bit more humble, usually. And then it develops your capacity to listen and to learn. And wisdom, well, that's hard to get and hard to find. And, it's a challenge to get there. But the simple fact is that to be an American is a very lucky thing. I mean, I'm very happy to be a Canadian, but to be an American is an amazingly lucky thing. And you have in your society something of which you should be very proud. But there's a difference between pride and arrogance. And that's the challenge.
If the use of military power to bend the countries to our will is no longer effective or legitimate, is the use of economic power also inappropriate? Was the use of economic sanctions to force Iran to a nuclear deal not appropriate?
No, I think I'm a believer that sanctions have their place in international law. They're hard to make effective. And I think the effort to isolate Iran because of its behavior towards its own people, towards its neighbors, and with respect to the nuclear issue, I think was appropriate, and I think it had effect. And I think it was far more effective than many of its critics allowed to be the case. Having said that, and I don't know whether there's going to be another question on Iran, I would add that it's important to understand that the sanctions against Iran were not only an American initiative, nor are the negotiations with Iran over ending the sanctions and dealing with the nuclear issue only an American issue. There are many other parties at the table and many other countries' interests at stake. And that's what, to me, makes the debate in the United States a little strange, because you'd sort of think that the only country that signed the deal with Iran was the United States, and you'd sort of think that it's up to the United States to decide whether or not the deal will go forward or not, or what will happen if the deal is not ratified. What will happen if the deal is not ratified? And I'll come back to this question in a minute, but just to answer the question, the impact will be this. The other countries who've signed the deal will not go back to the table. They will not enforce sanctions, in all likelihood. And Iran, on the other hand, will just say, well, screw it, we'll go forward with our nuclear program. And the United States will be trying to enforce sanctions that it can't enforce, because you can't do, one country alone can't enforce sanctions. It's not going to, American power does not go to that extent. So this is an example of what I learned, what I call consequential thinking. And here I'm going to tell you a true story. Not that all my other stories have been false. When I was, for a time, leader of a political party in the federal parliament in Canada, I had occasion to have meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Peres of Israel in very short order. They didn't come together because they can't stand each other, but they came within a month of each other. And the first visitor was Mr. Netanyahu. And the discussion with him was about half an hour, and it was Iran, 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 Iran. This was 3 years ago. And I'd met him before, and we'd had this discussion that we went through, so he just said, morally we can't accept Iran's position. They're an existential threat to the state of Israel. They can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons. You can't do any deals that allow them to, get out from under the sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So I said to him, oh, Mr. Prime Minister, I guess what you're saying is that there has to be a military solution. He said, well, military solution should never be ruled out, and we always have to maintain the military option. I said, fine. And a month later, Peres comes in. And we're chatting away, and I said to him, Mr. President, your Prime Minister was here, and he was talking about Iran. And he was even saying that he thought the military option should still be very much, on the table, and something that Israel would never abandon. So there's a long pause, and hope for all of us. Mr. Peres was 90 years old, totally on the ball, got all his, He looked at me, he says, so, Mr. Rae, he says, so we bomb Iran on the first day. Yeah. He says, what happens the second day? So he's what I call a consequential thinker. And Mr. Netanyahu is what I would call an ideological thinker. You think, this is not acceptable, this has to stop, and we have to stop it. You say, yeah, I understand that way of thinking. But statecraft requires another kind of thinking, which is, so what happens on the second day? How do we go through this process? How do we think this will unfold? And the absence of consequential thinking about the Iran situation strikes me as quite serious, because it's all very well to criticize what the inadequacies of what is in place. There are always going to be inadequacies, and there are serious inadequacies to this deal. The question is, if not this, then what? And how do you plan to go through that with everybody else, knowing that you're not in total command of all of what is in front of you?
There were a couple of other questions relating to this, which I think you have responded to.
I can always say the same thing over again.
Viewing American leadership in regards to the present nuclear deal, or can you relate the current imbroglio, Rae, the P5 and Germany agreement with Iran, to the decline of American power?
Well, look, don't beat yourselves up too much. American power is still militarily is is huge compared to any other country in the world. The phrase, I guess, is hegemony is not, no hegemony is absolute, no power structure is absolute. There are always going to be changes, and there's always going to be a dynamic. But if you said to me, is there any other country in the world that can match American military power? The answer is no, absolutely not. The question really is, well, how does that military power relate to economic power and the fact that economically the world is much more pluralistic and complex than one country's situation would lead you to believe. But of course, the situation that evolved after World War II was not sustainable. Other transformations have taken place in the world, and they've had a dramatic impact on the relative balance of economic strength around the world. But there's no way you can carry out an effective sanction policy against any country in the world without a broad universal support. That's what happened with South Africa. That's why the South African isolation was ultimately successful. And the Iranian situation is to say, well, that's the best deal we could get, which really also means it's the most the Europeans themselves would accept as being fair and reasonable in the circumstances. Inside the negotiations, it's not just the P5 negotiating as a unified bloc against the Iranians. It's also within the P5, some people saying, well, we're not really prepared to carry this on much longer, and others saying we've got to be prepared to go the full length of the road. But America can't do it on its own. You can't have a sanctions policy only carried out by one government. It doesn't work.
The America of Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan set the stage for the spread of democracy. How can that spirit be renewed during this time of globalization?
Well, it's true. That is what happened in Europe, and it is what happened, but I would say imperfectly in terms of how democracy evolved in Latin America, how it evolved in Asia. If you were to do a snapshot of what the world looked like in 1939, let's say, and what the world looked like in recent years, you'd see a dramatic transformation. I mean, democracy was a very challenged idea in 1939, when you think about it. You had Nazi Germany, you had Soviet Union, you had the British Empire. I mean, you had a whole bunch of things that were there in place. You had the French Empire, you had colonized Africa, you had colonized Asia. Democracy was a highly contested idea. Contested even in terms of its legitimacy. Like people say, well, what's so great about that? What's so wonderful about we have other ideas. And what's important, I think, to realize is that we now live in an era in which democracy is the gold standard. Yeah, and everybody says they're Democrat. Even if they're not remotely democratic, they say they are. Of course, and they particularly, they're not when they put it in their name, like the People's Democratic Republic of, that's a sure sign that, no way, that's not, that's hopeless. Just give up on that one. So, this is going to sound like a very trite answer. How do you keep the momentum going for democracy? The answer is you do it with your eyes fully open, knowing that this is going to be tough and this is not going to be easy. Restoring democracy to Europe in post-World War II was relatively easy, intellectually and ideologically, because the Europeans and the Western Europeans had had such a disastrous experience with totalitarianism. And they knew that was just a complete dead end. Plus, American economic power was so powerful, you can say, and by the way, here's what you get. You become part of the prosperity club. Why wouldn't you join it? And people say, that's great. Today, it's much more complicated. But don't let the complexity take you away from the desirability of the objective. I mean, I believe profoundly that there are universal values and that we should not be apologetic about our commitment to those values, to equality, to freedom, to respect for human dignity, to the rule of law, all the things that if we were to sit down at the table and say, what do we really believe in, what do we think, we'd find pretty quickly that this is what we think. And why do we think that? Well, we just think that's what that's deeply ingrained in what people need to live fully human lives. So, when Ahmadinejad came to Columbia University and said, we have no homosexuals in Iran, so we don't need to worry about that. We have no gay rights. There are no gay people. You say that's outrageous, and even people say that's, ridiculous, but, you get killed in Iran for being gay. You get murdered for being gay. You get indicted and tried and put in jail for being gay. Not a joke. It's a huge affront. And our own understanding of what it means to be human has evolved in the last 25, 30 years. I mean, the biggest change I've seen in politics, in my time in politics, has been this very question of gay rights. Not only has it changed legally, changed politically, it's changed in terms of opinions, and it's changed in terms of people's lives and people's awareness and people's sensibility and sensitivity. It's been a total transformation. And it's happened in the space of a few decades. So if it's happened with us and in our hearts as much as in our politics, it can happen anywhere. And it should, because there are gay people everywhere. So when people say, oh, there are no universal values, these are your values, they're not universal, I say, well, actually, I think this is what it means to be human. I think that to be able to be yourself as a human being is absolutely fundamental to my notion of dignity and of life. And if somebody says, well, we don't do it that way in our country because our country is different, I say, no, you don't do it in your way because your country is actually wrong. And what you're doing is wrong. And what you're doing is harmful to your own people. I don't think I'm being imperialistic when I say that. I think I'm just expressing some value that's pretty deeply ingrained. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that we should hold back on our support for democracy. What I do think is that we have to understand the challenge that it faces. China, not a democratic country by any remote stretch of the imagination, but a much more complicated place than it might have been seen 40, 50, 60 years ago. Capitalism is now deeply embedded in the Chinese way of life. And we all know that when you drive an economy to say freedom is important and ideas are important and innovation is important, eventually people say, but we've got this really crappy political system in which we're not allowed to say anything, and I can't go on the internet, how can I compete? And ultimately, it's what's going to affect the lack of transparency and openness in China is undermining its economic performance. In every respect, the joke about the rule of law in China, the fact that they have, there's so much repression, is terrible for their economic performance, and ultimately means that they're not the huge economic threat that some people might say they're not. They've got a long, long road to go. But we should never pull away from our conviction that, well, there is a better way to do this. And it's not because we're better than you are, it's just because we've taken us a while to get there, and this is part of what we believe.
Since Canada is a Kyoto signature, why push for Keystone Pipeline? Why not build the pipeline directly to the Pacific?
Well, this is a big issue for us as Canadians. I mean, first of all, the government that signed the Kyoto Agreement then went home and did nothing about it. which is not unique to Canadian governments, but it's a real problem and a real challenge. We also have this oil capacity in the ground, which we are having a huge challenge as a country getting to international markets. And as luck would have it, it's oil which requires a lot of upgrading, and the very act of exploiting it itself is very energy intensive. My own view is that the principle should be that we're all, as a globe, we're trying to move away from carbon dependency, and we need to move away from carbon dependency. But it's also a mistake to think that this is a process that's going to happen like that, because there's so much of our prosperity and way of life which is tied up with the oil business and with natural gas and everything else. Our government, I mean, Mr. Harper, I didn't come to the United States to denounce my prime minister, because I leave that to the New York Times, and I don't have to do anything about it. I just let them say, yeah, you're right. I just don't think they've figured it out that sustainability it's not some sort of Birkenstock wearing radical notion that has nothing to do with the production of wealth in Canada. We have to accept that we are part of the world, and that the direction of world thinking is taking us in a very clear direction, and we have to be part of that process. But there are inconsistencies in American policy with respect to Keystone that I think have to be pointed out. One is that the consequence of not having a pipeline is that oil will travel by rail. And so while the president, is going to be, if and when he turns down the pipeline, which has only taken him 8 years to make up his mind as to how he's going to deal with it, but he will deal with it presumably before he leaves. He'll say this is all part of the American environmental policy. At the same time as now Shell is now drilling in the Arctic, and you've got more stuff moving by rail than ever before in the history of the United States and the history of the North American economy, and that will only grow. So there is, frankly, lots of hypocrisy to go around on this question, which we share. We are having a tremendous debate in Canada about how to move this stuff and what has to be done to make it more sustainable. And that's part of what the debate in the election is going to be all about. And on October the 19th, we'll have an answer with respect to how that's going to be done. You have two opposition parties that now would appear to have more support, and it's a long campaign, so I'm not predicting anything. But they are certainly both talking the language of sustainability and the language of needing to address those issues as they relate to our production of oil and gas. But again, we're a relatively small economy, and as I said, I think when you look at an American policy, one can look at inconsistencies there as well. So I remain somebody who believes that Keystone is not such a big deal, one way or the it's not such a big deal to accept it, because it isn't defining the carbon economy, and it's not to not do it is not going to undefine the carbon economy. That's just an exaggeration.
The author of this next question included the subjects of immigration, climate control, tax reform, gun control, infrastructure, and the willingness to shut down the government. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you the first part of the question. Please discuss the degree to which the American role and its influence has been reduced by the paralysis of Congress to tackle these tough problems.
I think I was sort of implying this when I talked about the deficit issue and the budget problems of the United States, and the aversion to taxation. I do think that the challenge of the American political system is now becoming the subject of general discussion around the world, that this is something of great concern to all of us. And look, all of our systems have their limits and have their foibles and have their problems. It's just that America is a big place. And if America can't deal with some of these ongoing challenges in an effective way, it affects everybody. It doesn't just affect the United States. What happens here, simply by virtue of your size and also the power of your media and the power of your example, has an impact everywhere. So I would say the dysfunction of the American political system is a huge world problem. But all we can do is, as I said, is watch it and stress that it does seem to be having a great deal of difficulty in addressing some long-term underlying issues and problems. And I don't see the discourse or the debate in the United States leading us to being able to solve it and address it. I mean, it's really hard. To me, it's really tragic to see the immigration issue and say, well, you know, the solution seemed to be close at hand, it seemed to be there, and then it evaporates into the partisanship and the conflict between the president and the Congress, and then it doesn't happen. But look, any observer could look at Canada and say, well, you know, look at your system, and I'd say, yeah, there's a problem there that we have to address.
The last card I have here reflects our thanks to the committee and to you, and it says, Best Speaker of the Summer, ! Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.